March 3rd, 2009. 4:12 p.m. Vincenzo's Vintage Strings on West 48th Street in Midtown Manhattan. The kind of shop where session musicians and Juilliard professors drop serious money and never ask for a receipt. Where a handshake carries more weight than a credit card, and the instruments on the walls are treated with the reverence most people reserve for church. That afternoon, 61-year-old Raymond Kowalski sat behind his counter cataloging a 1962 Fender Stratocaster worth more than most people's annual salary, running his thumb along the neck the way a man touches something he knows the price of down to the last dollar. Then the front door swung open. The broad-shouldered man in the worn leather jacket who walked in was about to give Raymond the most humiliating education of his 30-year career. But Raymond didn't know that yet. In fact, he'd already decided exactly who this man was, in the time it takes to glance up from a guitar and look back down again. He was wrong about everything. But that's the thing about 30 years of being right. It stops feeling like confidence and starts feeling like fact. Raymond Kowalski had built his entire reputation on knowing the value of things. He had no idea he was about to meet the one man in New York City less likely to be fooled than he was. 30 years behind that counter, Raymond Kowalski had never once been wrong about a customer. He was about to find out what that kind of certainty actually costs. Subscribe now and stay with us. Raymond Kowalski had not planned to be a shopkeeper. He'd come to New York in 1971 with a music degree from Carnegie Mellon, a battered Telecaster, and the specific brand of confidence that only exists in 22-year-olds who've never yet been told no by a city. He was going to play jazz, session work first, then recording contracts, then something that looked like a career. He had the theory. He had the chops. What he didn't have, as it turned out, was the hunger that separates the people who almost make it from the people who do. By 1975, he was teaching guitar lessons out of a shared practice space on the Lower East Side. By 1979, he'd pooled 4 years of savings and opened a 2-room consignment shop on West 48th, a narrow storefront with water-stained ceilings and 7 instruments on the walls, 3 of which were his own. He called it Vincenzo's, after his grandfather. It was the first good decision of his professional life. 30 years later, the ceilings were high, as the instruments numbered in the hundreds, and Raymond's name carried weight in rooms where weight mattered. He'd authenticated a 1954 Les Paul Goldtop that 3 other dealers had dismissed as a refinish. He'd tracked provenance on a West Montgomery archtop all the way back to a 1963 recording session in Indianapolis and sold it to a collector in Tokyo for $180,000. He'd built something real out of something that had no right to succeed. The pride in that was justified. The arrogance that grew alongside it was not, because somewhere in the second decade, the craft had calcified into a system, and the system had calcified into certainty. Raymond could read a customer in 10 seconds. Budget, intent, knowledge level, time-waster probability, all of it assembled and filed before the person had taken 3 steps inside. It was efficient. It was reliable. It had never once been catastrophically wrong. Until today. Dante Morano had grown up in Red Hook, Brooklyn, in a 3rd-floor apartment that smelled like cigarettes and Sunday gravy, and every evening without exception, music. His father, Giuseppe, had come from Palermo in 1951 with $40, a work visa, and a D'Angelico archtop guitar wrapped in a wool blanket inside a canvas bag. Giuseppe Morano was not a musician in any professional sense. He poured concrete and laid pipe for 36 years and came home with hands so rough they could sand wood. But every night, after dinner, he would sit in the kitchen chair by the window and play that guitar with the quiet devotion of a man for whom music was the only thing in life that required nothing back. Dante would fall asleep to it. The warm, full resonance of the archtop filling the apartment, his father's thick fingers moving across the strings with a gentleness they never showed anywhere else. It was the most beautiful thing Dante had ever known. Not just the sound, the whole picture. His father, and that guitar, and the light from the kitchen window, and the feeling that some things in the world were simply stubbornly good. Giuseppe died in the spring of 1987. The guitar disappeared in the weeks after. The chaos of an estate settled by people who didn't know what they had, distributed among cousins who cared even less. Dante had looked for it, quietly, over the years. Not with urgency. The way you look for something you know is probably gone, but can't quite bring yourself to stop searching for. And he wasn't thinking about any of this when he turned onto West 48th Street that afternoon. He'd just finished a lunch meeting at a restaurant his family held a quiet interest in, 2 blocks over, nothing complicated. And he was walking back to his car when something in the window of a narrow shop stopped him. A silhouette. A hollow-body archtop on a low shelf, half obscured by a display stand. Dusty, barely visible. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then he went in. Raymond looked up from his counter. Leather jacket, heavy build, gold ring, right hand, glasses, moves slow, not browsing slow, something else, construction maybe, or union management. He set down his pen. $500 budget if I'm being generous. I'll be polite, I'll be brief. He had no idea. Raymond came around the counter before Dante had taken 6 steps into the shop. It was a practiced move, smooth, unhurried, designed to look like hospitality while functioning as interception. He'd perfected it over 30 years. Guide the uncertain customer toward the center display case before they could wander, before they could touch something they shouldn't, before the afternoon became complicated. Steer them toward the crown jewel. Let the guitar do the qualifying. "Let me show you something," Raymond said, and his voice had shifted into the register he used for this. Warm, authoritative, the tone of a man doing you a favor by sharing a secret. He placed both palms on the glass case at the center of the shop and waited for Dante to approach. Inside, and under a low halogen light that Raymond had angled with the precision of a museum curator, sat the 1963 Gibson ES 335. Original cherry finish, so deep, and even it looked wet. Factory Tuno-matic bridge, patent sticker humbuckers, both original. Not a single modification in 60 years. The kind of guitar that made serious collectors go very quiet. 1963 ES 335, Raymond began. One previous owner, a studio musician out of Hartford who bought it new and put it in a humidity-controlled case 11 months later. Never toured with it, never modified it, played it maybe 40 times in 40 years before his daughter consigned it here. He paused for effect, the way he always did at this point in the presentation. It is, in every measurable sense, as close to the day it left the Kalamazoo factory as any ES 335 you will ever find. $45,000. And I'll tell you honestly, that price goes up every year. Dante had stopped in front of the case. He looked at the guitar for a long moment, not with the wide-eyed reverence Raymond was used to seeing, not with the performative appreciation of a man trying to seem knowledgeable. Just looked at it. Quietly. The way you look at something you're actually thinking about. Then he said, "Can I hold it?" Raymond's expression shifted. Barely, but it shifted. The careful smile, the slight straightening of posture, the practiced pause that meant we've reached a threshold. "I typically need to verify," he said, "that we're having a serious conversation before I allow handling of pieces in this price range." He kept his voice even, professional, almost apologetic. The language of policy, not judgment. It was, Raymond had always felt, a perfectly reasonable way to handle the situation. What it actually was, what it had always been, was a door closing. Quietly, politely. "You don't belong here." Dante looked at him, not with anger, not with embarrassment. Just looked at him, 2 full seconds of flat, patient eye contact that carried no heat whatsoever, which somehow made it worse. It was the look of a man who had been told far more insulting things by far more dangerous people and had responded with far less mercy than he was showing right now. A look that had nothing left to prove. Then he turned away from the case entirely. Raymond exhaled. Good. Clean. Saved us both 15 minutes. He moved back toward his counter, already mentally returning to the Stratocaster catalog, already closing the file on this particular afternoon. But Dante wasn't moving toward the door. Raymond looked up. The man was walking deeper into the shop, past the second display case, past the vintage amp wall, past the framed photographs of former clients that Raymond kept positioned at eye level, a quiet gallery of credibility. He was moving toward the back, toward the far left corner, toward the part of Vincenzo's that Raymond privately thought of as the waiting room for instruments that hadn't yet found a reason to leave. Raymond watched. There was something in the way the man moved that he couldn't immediately categorize. And Raymond could categorize everything. Too deliberate for a browser, too unhurried for someone with a specific purchase in mind. Like a man who already knew where he was going and was simply taking his time getting there. Probably just looking, Raymond told himself. He picked up his pen, looked back down at his catalog, but he didn't write anything. The back left corner of Vincenzo's vintage strings was the only part of the shop Raymond never showed anyone. Not because it was hidden. It was right there, visible from the counter if you knew where to look. But in 30 years of running this shop, Raymond had developed a talent for directing attention, and he never directed it here. This was the graveyard section. The embarrassments. Instruments he'd accepted as trade-ins to close other deals. Taken in the way you take something you don't want because refusing it would cost you something you do. A Gretsch country gentleman with a neck bow so severe you couldn't play above the 5th fret without the strings kissing the frets. A 1970s Japanese Telecaster copy with the brand name filed off. Someone's attempt at a deception so half-hearted it was almost insulting. A mandolin with a headstock crack repaired with what appeared to be standard wood glue and optimism. All of them tagged in Raymond's handwriting on strips of masking tape. All of them priced low enough to move but never actually moving. And on the bottom shelf, shoved behind a cardboard box of old vintage guitar magazines that Raymond had been meaning to throw away for 2 years, a hollow-body archtop. It looked like something recovered from a flood. The finish had worn almost entirely through to bare wood on the lower bout. Not the dignified checking of a well-aged instrument, but the complete surrender of lacquer that had simply given up. The tuning pegs were mismatched. Yet 2 of them replacements from a different decade entirely. A crack ran along the binding on the treble side, repaired badly at some point in the past with the wrong adhesive, the edges slightly raised where the glue had dried proud of the surface. Raymond's masking tape tag was still on the headstock. $300. As is, no returns. He'd taken it in 6 months ago, part of an estate sale lot. 5 instruments in a cardboard box, $400 for the whole thing, a transaction completed in under 10 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd given the archtop a single glance, registered it as a mid-century student-grade wall piece, and put it on the bottom shelf. He hadn't looked at it since. He was looking at it now. Dante had crouched down at the bottom shelf with the unhurried focus of a man who had found what he came for, even if he couldn't have told you, 10 minutes ago, that he was looking for anything at all. He reached behind the cardboard box, lifted the guitar out with both hands, the way you lift something you already know is fragile. "Sir." Raymond's voice came from across the shop, patient, slightly strained. "That's a trade-in piece. Came in as part of a lot. Honestly, it needs a full refret, new tuners, probably a neck reset." He paused. "I'll do $200 if you want it. Save yourself the conversation." Dante didn't answer. He turned the guitar slowly in his hands, pressed his thumb into the wood of the neck, not testing the action, not checking playability, pressing into the grain itself, feeling the density, the particular resistance of wood that had been drying for 70 years. He tilted the body toward the window and studied the spruce top in the afternoon light coming through the glass. The tight, even grain pattern, the way the light moved across it. Then he looked into the F-hole. He held it there for a long time, angling it toward the light, trying to make out the label inside. It was faded, barely legible, but the handwriting, even from here, even through the shadow, was in a script he recognized, not from study, not from catalogs, from childhood, from a kitchen window in Red Hook, from evenings that smelled like cigarettes and gravy and the warm resonance of a hollow-body guitar being played by a man with construction workers' hands and a musician's patience. This wasn't his father's guitar. Giuseppe's was gone. I lost to the careless arithmetic of a grieved family settling an estate. But the shape of the body, the curvature of the waist, the particular way the light fell through that F-hole onto a handwritten label. Dante knew this instrument the way you know a face that belongs to someone you've lost. He stood up slowly, set the guitar on the counter, looked at Raymond. "What do you think this is worth?" You already know Raymond is about to get this catastrophically wrong. What happens next is where everything breaks open. The $90,000 revelation, the evidence piece by piece, and the moment Raymond realizes the answer was on his shelf the entire time. Subscribe now, so you don't miss it. Raymond glanced at the masking tape tag, then back at Dante. 300, he said. Maybe 250 if you factor in what it needs. And what it needs is substantial. New tuners, full refret, neck reset, and whatever that binding repair is going to cost you to undo properly. He spread his hands in a gesture of professional sympathy. Honestly, at $200 I'm doing you a favor. Save yourself the headache. Dante looked at him. This is a 1954 D'Angelico New Yorker. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, the voice of a man stating a fact he has known for several minutes and is only now sharing. Custom order. John D'Angelico built this one himself, by hand, in his shop on Kenmare Street. There were 11 made with this exact binding configuration. He set the guitar on the counter between them. It's worth $90,000. The shop went completely silent. Raymond heard the number. His brain received it, processed it, and rejected it in approximately the same moment. Then he laughed, a short, airless sound, the involuntary response of a man whose certainty has just been struck and doesn't yet know how badly it's cracked. "I'm sorry," he said. No, that's not what this is." Dante didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for the guitar. "Look at the label." Raymond found his flashlight under the counter. He angled it through the F-hole the way he'd done 10,000 times with 10,000 instruments, and he looked. The label was there, faded to the color of old tea, but there. And the handwriting, even at this magnification, even through 30 years of accumulated dust on the inside of the body, was in a script that Raymond's professional memory recognized before his conscious mind could catch up. D'Angelico had handwritten every custom serial himself. The pen pressure, the particular slant of the capital letters, the way the ink had aged, Raymond had seen authenticated D'Angelicos before. He'd handled 2 in his career. He knew exactly what this looked like. He had known exactly what this looked like. He just hadn't looked. That was the thing that would stay with him longest. Not what Dante knew, but what Raymond had failed to do. The label hadn't been hidden. The guitar hadn't been disguised. It had been on his shelf, in his shop, under his ownership for 6 months. And he had looked at the finish and the tuning pegs and the masking tape price of his own handwriting and decided in one unconsidered glance that he already knew what it was. He hadn't looked. In 30 years of never missing anything, he had simply stopped seeing an entire shelf. "The binding crack," Dante said, and Raymond realized he'd gone completely still, flashlight still angled into the F-hole. That's a 1970s amateur repair. Wrong adhesive. You can see where it dried proud of the surface. Someone who loved it but didn't know what they had. The wear pattern on the lower bout is 70 years of a left-handed player's forearm in the same position. You can't fake that kind of wear. It's not damage. He paused. It's biography. He turned the neck toward Raymond. Feel the asymmetry. D'Angelico shaped his custom New Yorker necks by hand. No factory produces this profile. No copyist in 1954 knew enough to replicate it. Raymond set the flashlight down. His hands were not entirely steady. How do you know all this? His voice came out quieter than he intended. Dante was silent for a moment. My father played one his whole life. Every evening, my whole childhood. I grew up listening to it. He looked at the guitar on the counter between them. I know what they look like, even when they've been forgotten. The room held that for a moment. Raymond understood, then, what had actually happened here. Dante hadn't come in to prove something. He hadn't been performing or competing or settling a score. He had walked past a window, seen a shape he recognized from the most important years of his life, and walked in to confirm what he already knew. Raymond hadn't been the audience for any of this. He'd been the obstacle. Dante picked up the guitar, held it for just a moment. Carefully, the way you hold something that belongs to a feeling you can't get back. Then he set it down on the counter with the quiet finality of a man returning something to its proper place. Don't sell it to a collector who'll lock it away. He turned toward the door. Find someone who'll play it. Then he walked away. Wait! Raymond's voice came out wrong, too thin, stripped of the authority it had carried all afternoon. Dante was 3 steps from the door. Who are you? Dante stopped. A beat of stillness. Then he turned halfway, just enough to answer over his shoulder, the way a man turns when the question doesn't require his full attention. Dante Morano. He left. The door swung shut behind him. The small bell above the frame rang once, the same way it rang for everyone, and then the shop was quiet. Raymond stood at his counter holding a $90,000 guitar and said nothing for a very long time. And the name didn't come from newspapers. Dante Morano was too careful for newspapers. Too careful, frankly, for most things that left a visible mark. The name came from conversations that stopped when certain people walked into certain rooms. From the particular quality of silence that settled over a table at Patsy's when someone leaned in and said it quietly. From the way a city attorney Raymond knew had once excused himself from a dinner the moment that name came up, and never explained why. Raymond knew the name the way people who live in a city long enough know certain names. Not from direct contact, but from the shape they leave on everything around them. A man whose judgment, in his particular world, was not a professional asset, but a survival mechanism. 35 years of reading people, situations, and value in rooms where being wrong didn't cost you a commission. It cost you everything. Raymond set the guitar down on the counter, carefully. The first realization arrived with the blunt efficiency of a bill coming due. The man he had refused to let hold a $45,000 guitar, the man he had assessed in 4 seconds and filed under not our kind of buyer, could have purchased Vincenzo's vintage strings outright. The building it sat in, possibly, without a phone call, without blinking. The Stratocasters on the wall, the ES-335 in the display case, the framed photographs of former clients that Raymond kept positioned to remind visitors who they were dealing with, all of it absorbed as a rounding error. And the second realization was slower and cut deeper. The man who had just identified a 1954 D'Angelico New Yorker from across a room, from a bottom shelf, behind a cardboard box, through 30 years of accumulated grime, was a man whose professional life had been built entirely on the ability to see what things were actually worth. Not what they appeared to be worth. Not what a label said they were worth. What they actually were underneath everything. Dante Morano had spent 35 years in rooms where a single misread cost you your life. He did not misread things, and Raymond had looked at him, at those flat, patient eyes, that deliberate stillness, that particular quality of attention, and decided in 4 seconds that he knew exactly what he was looking at. The third realization didn't arrive so much as settle. It the way cold settles into a room when someone leaves a window open. Raymond had not simply missed a guitar. He had systematically dismissed the one person who walked into his shop that afternoon who was constitutionally, professionally, existentially incapable of being wrong about value. He had deployed his 30 years of expertise against the single customer least likely to be humbled by it, and he had done it with complete confidence. The shop was very quiet. Raymond looked down at the guitar on the counter. The masking tape price tag was still on the headstock, slightly crooked in his own handwriting. $300. As is. No returns. He looked at it for a moment. Then he peeled it off slowly, the tape releasing with a sound that seemed too loud in the empty room. He held it between 2 fingers, looked at those 5 words one more time, and then he dropped it in the trash. He carried the guitar to his back office, set it on his desk with both hands, closed the door, turned the lock. Then he sat down in his chair and stared at the wall, and said nothing to no one for a very long time. He waited 6 weeks before making the call. Not because he doubted what Dante had told him. The label alone had settled that question the same afternoon, the moment Raymond's flashlight found the handwriting inside the F-hole. He waited because calling Dr. Elaine Marsh required a level of professional exposure that Raymond had spent 30 years carefully avoiding. You didn't contact the Smithsonian's senior instrument historian with a maybe. You contacted her with something real, and you accepted that she would tell everyone worth telling exactly how you'd come to have it. Doctor. Marsh was 64, based in Washington, and had built her reputation on 2 things: authenticating 4 D'Angelico instruments that now resided in permanent museum collections, and rejecting 11 fakes that had fooled people who should have known better. She did not travel for uncertain cases. Her time was too valuable, and her reputation too carefully maintained for anything she wasn't already confident about before she boarded the plane. Raymond sent photographs on a Tuesday morning. 47 images. Every angle, every detail, the F-hole label under 3 different light sources. He wrote a single line of accompanying text. I believe this is a 1954 New Yorker custom. I need to know if I'm right. She called him Thursday evening. I'll be there Saturday. She worked for 2 days at Raymond's counter with the focused silence of someone who has long since stopped needing to narrate what she's doing. The UV light came first, swept slowly across the spruce top, revealing the original finish layers in fluorescent relief, the factory lacquer glowing a distinct amber that no refinish could replicate without leaving shadows, inconsistencies, the telltale evidence of removal. There were none. The finish was original to the wood beneath it, applied once, aged uniformly across 7 decades. The dendrochronology took most of the first afternoon. Dr. Marsh examined the grain pattern of the spruce top under magnification, measuring the annual ring density against reference samples from verified early 1950s D'Angelico instruments in the Smithsonian's archive. Tight. Even growth. Pacific Coast Sitka, same sourcing as D'Angelico's confirmed 1953 and 1955 customs, consistent with early 1954 construction. On the second morning, she examined the binding crack. She worked in silence for several minutes, then reached into her case for a chemical test kit Raymond didn't recognize. She applied a small sample to the adhesive residue at the edge of the repair, waited 90 seconds, and read the result. Hide glue, she said. Specific formula. They discontinued it in 1978. She didn't look up. Amateur repair, probably mid-70s. Someone who cared enough to fix it but didn't know what they were working with. She moved to the lower bout. Spent a long time there, saying nothing, her magnifying glass moving slowly across the wear pattern in the finish. Then she set the glass down. Left-handed player, she said. Forearm contact, same position for decades. She said it the way you state something obvious. Not to anyone in particular, simply because it was true. At the end of the second day, she set down her magnifying glass, straightened up, and looked at Raymond across the counter with an expression he couldn't immediately read. "Where did you get this?" Raymond told her. "The estate sale lot, the cardboard box, the $400 he'd paid for 5 instruments. The 6 months it had spent on the bottom shelf." She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Genuine," she said. 1954. D'Angelico, New Yorker, custom order. 7th of 11 built with this binding configuration. 1 of 9 still in verified existence." She paused. "Auction estimate, conservatively, $85,000 to $110,000. Another pause, shorter. "The man who told you what this was, he was being conservative." Raymond did not sell it to the first collector who called, or the second. He spent 3 weeks making inquiries through channels he'd never used for this purpose. Not auction houses or high-end dealers, but musicians. Working musicians. People who played for a living and understood what an instrument was actually for. He found his buyer in New Orleans, a jazz guitarist named Calvin Turode, 67, who had played professionally for 40 years and still performed 4 nights a week at a club on Frenchman Street. Calvin flew to New York, held the guitar for 11 minutes without saying a word, and wrote a check for $97,000. Raymond's commission was $9,700. See, he donated $970 of it, exactly 10%, to a music education foundation operating out of Red Hook, Brooklyn. He didn't tell anyone why he'd chosen Red Hook. He knew why. The glass case came out first. Raymond had it removed on a Monday morning in April, 2 weeks after Calvin Turode flew back to New Orleans with the D'Angelico wrapped in a soft case under his arm. 2 men carried the case out through the front door while Raymond stood at his counter and watched, and didn't feel the loss he'd expected to feel. The case had been the centerpiece of Vincenzo's for 20 years. The thing your eye found first when you walked in. The thing that announced what kind of shop this was and what kind of customer was welcome. That was exactly why it had to go. The crown jewels went on the wall. Accessible. Visible. At eye level. And where anyone could stand in front of them without needing permission, without needing to be assessed first. Raymond told himself it was a practical change. He knew it was a confession. The intake process came next. Every trade-in, regardless of appearance, regardless of what the person bringing it in said it was worth, regardless of how much Raymond's 30 years of instinct wanted to file it and move on, received a full professional examination before pricing. Every instrument. No exceptions. No assumptions. The policy was written down and posted in the back room where Raymond could see it from his desk. He called his part-time assistant, Maya, on a Wednesday. She'd been with him for 2 years, reliable and careful in most things. She had been the one who'd accepted the estate sale box 6 months before Dante walked in, glanced at the contents, written up a rough intake sheet, and stacked the instruments in the back corner without further examination. Raymond had done exactly the same thing when he'd looked them over himself. He knew that. He fired her anyway, because the shop needed the policy to have teeth, and then he called her back the following morning and offered her a different position. Every new intake was her sole and primary responsibility, full examination, documented provenance research, no instrument priced until the process was complete. She accepted. She was better at the job than Raymond had ever bothered to notice. 2 years later, a writer from Vintage Guitar magazine came to do a profile on the shop. Toward the end of the interview, almost as an afterthought, she asked about his biggest professional mistake. Raymond didn't hesitate. I had a $90,000 guitar in my shop for 6 months priced at $300. A man I'd already decided couldn't afford to be there told me exactly what it was. He was right about the guitar. He was right about everything. The writer looked up. What did that teach you? Raymond was quiet for a moment. That expertise without humility is just a longer way of being ignorant. I spent 30 years learning to see, and then I stopped looking. He looked. That's the whole difference. Do you know who he was? Yes. Did you ever contact him? No. A pause. Some lessons you just have to carry. On the wall behind Raymond's counter, level with his eye line when he sits at his desk, there is a small index card in a plain frame, and his own handwriting. It reads, March 3rd, 2009. A man I underestimated walked into this shop. He saw in 30 seconds what I had missed for 6 months. Not because he knew more, because he was looking with something I wasn't. Memory, loss, love. RK. Raymond never found out what happened to Dante Morano's father's guitar. But he thinks about it sometimes. The idea of a man who spent his whole life in rooms where people were afraid of him, carrying a quiet grief about a piece of music he'd lost. He thinks about how that grief had made Dante the only person in that shop who knew what he was looking at. Raymond had 30 years of knowledge. Dante had one thing Raymond didn't. He knew what it felt like to lose something beautiful. That's what made the difference. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been the person who got looked past, or the person who almost threw away something priceless because you stopped looking, then you already understand what Raymond learned the hard way. There are more stories like this one, stories about value hidden in plain sight, about the people nobody sees coming, about what happens when real expertise meets real humility, and what it costs when they don't. Subscribe, so the next one finds you.